Good evening. Hope everybody's doing well today. We are actually currently on vacation in North Carolina, and so I thought it might be fun to do the summer series, kind of take you along with us on our journey. So I hope you enjoy the change of scenery. I know a lot of you probably been stuck at home for a while. So in our summer series, we are covering the great men of faith that are found in Hebrews chapter 11. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and open up your Bibles. So the Bible's Hall of Fame, there's all these vivid pictures of these men who kind of shine forth as examples as to what great faith looks like. Jared, he actually provided some good context for us for Hebrews 11. He talked about how this was written to former Jewish Christians who they had faced a lot of hardships as they left their old ways for this kind of crazy new thing called Christianity. So verse 1 of Hebrews 11 starts out, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation." And that's the big thing here, is this whole idea of it's not seen, right? And verses 4 through 7, we see there's mention of Abel, Enoch, and Noah. And then verses 8, we get to Abraham, and he is given a lot of verses. Verses 8 through 19. So that's what we'll look at tonight, are those key verses. So Hebrews chapter 11 verse 8 starts out, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out of the place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to that city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore." Kind of fitting. "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them, and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared them a city. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, 'Through Isaac shall your offspring be named.' He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back." So that is the faith of Abraham. You know, we call these people the heroes of faith, but usually when we think of heroes, we typically don't picture, 100-year-old men and their son. But that's the faith of a man that we're going to paint a picture of today. It's interesting to know, if you look at all these people in Hebrews 11, they're actually all descendants of Abraham, except for Abel and Enoch. So it's kind of neat that one man can impact so many people. In this chronicle, it's kind of interesting, Abraham's given about half the space. And if you look at his life throughout the books of Genesis, he's given chapters 11 through 50. Him and his family are spread over all those chapters. So it's kind of interesting to think about, and it begs the question, what was there in the life of Abraham that was so special that he was deemed this great man of faith? As we've been going through Genesis on Sunday mornings, I remember Abraham has messed up a lot as we go through our studies. It kind of makes you wonder, how can this man be that great example of faith? And it kind of encourages me because, if he's referred to as this man of great faith with all his flaws, then just maybe there could be hope for the rest of us. So his story begins in the Ur of the Chaldeans, and he was actually living a very comfortable life in pleasant circumstances. It was a prosperous city with a lot of lovely homes, probably similar to those in North Carolina. Beautiful parks, public buildings, that sort of thing. So he was comfortable, he was secure in the land of Ur, but it was also a wicked pagan city. And one of the things I read said this was no place for Abraham's faith to be nurtured, which I thought was interesting. Maybe you can relate. We've loved some beautiful places, but we've just known this is not the place to nurture our faith and for the faith of our families. According to Genesis 12:1, God directs Abraham to leave Ur, leave his kindred, and dwell in tents the rest of his life. I enjoy camping as much as the next person, but if you've ever tried spending multiple nights in a tent, it's not a lot of fun. So Abraham's kind of committed to this nomadic lifestyle. And to leave your father's house at this day and age was actually a great cost. It's leaving behind your inheritance, your claims to property, surrendering his home, his faith, his family, all the things that are basically core to our identity. He walked away from. Hebrews 11:8 records, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his possession, obeyed and went. That's the key there, even though he did not know where he was going. But it does seem that Abraham had some hang-ups. Famine comes to Canaan, and so Abraham seeks refuge in Egypt. And the text says he intended to sojourn or live there for a while. And so there's some debate as to whether or not that was motivated by faith or not, because it seemed like he kind of wanted to stay for a while. And so one of the things that Whitworth talks about in his book, The Epic of God, he said, we are thereby represented with a mirror image of our own faith journey, an example of the sudden transition that can be made from the plane of faith to fear. And I think most of us can relate, kind of maybe making a pit stop on our journey of faith that we probably shouldn't be making, perhaps settling into a place, a habit, a routine we know we shouldn't stay. And it's here where Abraham encounters issues, like he has the issues with Pharaoh desiring Sarah, and he kind of lies to cover that up. And we find Abraham being somewhat passive and fearful in the beginning part of his journey of faith. It's interesting to note Pharaoh awards Abraham, or Abram at the time, with all this stuff as a substantial bride price of livestock and servants. And these things that Pharaoh gives to Abraham, they end up being seeds of crisis, that Whitworth calls them. Because we see the livestock, they actually create conflict with Abraham and Lot's herdsmen. And then one of the female slaves we know ends up causing a rift with Abraham and Sarah. So sin's reward, Michael Whitworth says, always proves to be our undoing. And these aren't the only recorded examples of Abraham's fear and faithlessness. There was also kind of his lack of faith in God's promise for a son. However, Abraham, he eventually experienced this kind of remarkable transformation of being the father of the faithful. So it's kind of this gradual metamorphosis that we see, and it gives us hope today that we too can grow in our faith. Whitworth says our walk of faith sometimes seems to be one step forward and two steps back, and I think if we're being honest, we can all kind of relate with that. To succeed in his new life with God, Abraham had to leave his old life behind, for faith demands a ruthless abandonment of the past. Before they know it, Christians can become too comfortable with what faith requires, too cozy in maybe a relationship we have no right to be in, too cozy with a habit that's not really consistent with godliness, too cozy with a career that may be leading you away from the heart of God. All these things, Michael Whitworth says, can hijack an incredible opportunity to trust in God with our whole heart. So we see this great paradox of faith. The only way to abandon hopelessness is to abandon all else but God. It kind of reminds me of a Christian song I've heard. Maybe you've heard it. It says, I want to live with abandon. And that's certainly how Abraham intended to live. So as we look in Hebrews chapter 11 and move to verse 9, we see that Abraham really was just looking for God to supply his needs. It says, by faith he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who are heirs with him of the same promise. And then moving on to verse 10, we see that Abraham really was looking forward to eternity. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So Abraham had hope for this life, but he also had hope for a better life that was yet to come. So he had kind of a long-term, eternal perspective. I'm also amazed at Abraham's ability to just let go. When it came to his nephew Lot, you think about when they kind of had the decision about the land they were going to go to, Abraham deferred to Lot and let him have the best pick of the land. We see Abraham, he becomes a warrior. We see he sets out to save Lot once Lot gets in trouble. And then we see Scripture's first mention of the cruelty of war. But we see Abraham who is willing to fight. We see Abraham, he's growing in his faith. He's getting stronger. And in his appreciation to God, we see Abraham tithe. And at this time, Abraham doesn't allow himself to be enriched at another's expense when the king then tries to come and give Abraham gifts. So he's learning, he's growing. So we have the cowardly, kind of scheming Abraham at the beginning in Egypt, who now has given way to becoming this daring warrior who's trust in God and realizes that the battle does belong to the Lord. So Abraham, despite his great faith, he did have one big frustration. For most of his life, he and his wife Sarah had no children. A lot of people at that time believed that this was to be kind of like a curse. And maybe perhaps it left Abraham wondering, does God really care? I think we've all felt this way at times. And a lot of times we're tempted to maybe take things into our own hands. So we know what Abraham and Sarah did. Sarah, she is actually commended for her faith as well in Hebrews 11:11. But she suggests to Abraham that he has a child by Hagar, who was one of the Egyptian slaves that they had brought back with them from Egypt. So Ishmael's born, and Abraham's heart is delighted, but this was not the plan of God for the line of faith that would culminate in Christ. In 17:18, Abraham begs, "Oh, that Ishmael may live before you," basically meaning, let's just have Ishmael inherit what you've promised me. To believe that he and Sarah would conceive a son just really seemed to be too much. Evidently, God's people are at times willing to settle for less than what God has in mind. Instead of living by faith and receiving what is awesome, we're content to live by sight and settle for the ordinary. One of the things Whitworth asks is, what would our families and churches, marriages and businesses look like if we were to seek God's true will rather than asking him to settle for our own? What if we, as the patriarch eventually did, learn to submit the impossible to the sovereignty of God Almighty? So Whitworth talks about the long-term effects of Ishmael being born, and it's kind of funny, he calls him the world's 4,000-year-old headache, and basically referring to the Isaac and Ishmael rivalry that really still exists today and has ravaged just a lot of the Middle East, where children of Ishmael and Isaac still war against each other. And one of the big points here is doing things our own way can really have a lot of these lasting consequences that we don't want. And we can see that throughout the life of Abraham. When Abraham was already 99 years old and Sarah was 90, there's really no basis for human hope that they would have any children. Nevertheless, God said in Genesis 17, "Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac." And Hebrews records it in Hebrews 11:11 through 12. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sands of the seashore. So Abraham, by faith, believed that God would supernaturally give him a son. So it seems that we do still see a lot of back and forth with Abraham's faith. Whitworth says, to this point, Abraham has run the gamut of spiritual maturity In the past 4 decades or so, he has endured many highs and many lows. He was willing to displace his family from their homeland, but unwilling to be honest about his marriage when he called Sarah his sister. He was willing to attack superior enemy forces, but cowered before kings and subjected himself to his wife's occasional whims. So we see him being passive at times, kind of like, Adam in the garden. So always at stake on these occasions was the question, does Abraham trust God to provide? Trusting in God's provision instead of relying on our own is what the life of faith is all about. Will we trust in God's provision, or will we fall for Satan's lie? Doubt in God's provision is really the root of our rebellion. Whitwer says, I'm convinced that at some critical juncture in life, we are put to the supreme test by being called to surrender to God that which is most dear to us. A relationship, a deal, a habit, a possession. Only when God is most dear can we have fully experience the greatness of life with Him. Romans 4 tells us that Abraham did not waver. So we read that he didn't waver, but it seems like from some of the things that we know about Abraham that maybe he did waver. So how do we reconcile Paul's words with Abraham's life? Well, perhaps an old woodsman's proverb can kind of help resolve this tension. It says a tree is best measured when it's laying down. So God looks at our lives with more of a wide-angle lens and not a telephoto zoom. The final verdict will not be rendered on our life until the end of our life. Our tree will not be measured until it's lying down. So yes, Abraham lied or deceived about his relationship with Sarah. Yes, Ishmael was born out of somewhat of a twisted plan. But God sought to create in Abraham, to borrow a phrase from Friedrich Nietzsche, a long obedience in the same direction. The life of faith is a marathon and not a sprint. So have you stumbled? Pause and regain your balance. Have you fallen? Get up. The race is not over. That's why Paul could write concerning Abraham. He did not waver through unbelief, the promise of God. The supreme test of Abraham's faith was yet to come. Fiery tests of faith which occur early in life sometimes climax in much greater test of faith in a time of spiritual maturity, and this was the case with Abraham. When Isaac had reached his early teens, God told Abraham to do a very strange thing. One day he said to Abraham, "Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will tell you." Pretty unbelievable command concerning all of the effort that had taken place and the years spent waiting for this promised son. In Abraham, he understands sacrifice. Something I read said his life had been framed by a series of altars. Each time he experiences the presence and provision of the Lord, he can't help but to offer praise. Even though Abraham had been accustomed to human sacrifices in his pagan life in Ur, how could this possibly fit into the plan of God? What was to happen to all the promises that depended on Isaac? And it's interesting to note that he did not delay. It says early the next morning he began his journey. In Abraham, he was prepared not just to stab his son, but to offer him as a burnt offering meant he had to slaughter his son, to disembowel Isaac as if he were an ox from his herd. This is the depth of the patriarch's commandment, to obey his God. When Isaac asked the question, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham provided, "God will provide." Hebrews 11, verse 17 through 18 says, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son." Hebrews 11:19 says, "Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead." This is the great faith of Abraham. Biblical faith believes that God gives, God takes away, and God can restore again. Biblical faith believes that God alone provides. So in closing, Abraham is is a man who, like all of us, he had his fair share of ups and downs. He was far from perfect, as we've read, but he finished strong. So no matter where you're at in your faith, you too can finish strong. You can turn it around, because we serve the same God as Abraham, the God who still provides for us today through his son, Jesus Christ.